As we began the liturgy of the Word today, we heard a passage from the book of Genesis, a very famous passage about Abraham and his hospitality. The church has chosen this particular reading to complement the gospel reading, as it often happens, to give us a deeper understanding that they shed light on each other. So we're going to begin by reflecting on that reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 18. God has already made a covenant with Abram and changed his name to Abraham. He's already made promises to him. He's already promised that he would be the father of a great multitude. But Abraham is concerned because his wife Sarah has never been able to bear children. He has a son by another woman, but it's not quite the same. He wants his own flesh and blood, as it were. So that's the story behind the story. He's preoccupied with this, no doubt, as his wife Sarah is. But then three strangers appear. Now remember, this is in the desert. Distances between towns and villages would be significant, and especially during the hot period, strangers really needed a place to rest and be cared for. This brings up the question of hospitality in the ancient world. It was really often a matter of life and death. People needed each other to be kind and hospitable. We think sometimes of the word hospitality in terms of what we do on vacation, the people who take care of us, provide lodging and restaurants and so forth. You know that it's a whole industry now, isn't it? We call it the hospitality industry. And people get degrees in hospitality. Maybe some of you have one. It's something very important in our culture, but it's different than it was back then, in the sense that it wasn't professionalized then. Everybody was involved in it. Everyone had the duty, because they were part of society, to be hospitable to the stranger and to treat the guest with great deference. You notice, here is Abraham, the patriarch. So the Jew immediately, listening to this passage, this is Abraham. And what is he doing? He's humbling himself to extend hospitality to these strangers. And he gets up in the heat of the day when he sees them coming, and he prostrates himself, welcoming them, and then offers them first some water, most necessary, and then, come, share what I have is yours. And then he goes and does the preparations. So immediately, he tells his wife to get the rolls ready. And she goes and does it dutifully. And then he tells the servants, now get things ready. And he himself goes and picks out the choice steer. And so everything is very busy, isn't it? All because these three strangers have come. This moment in salvation history has been memorialized by an icon of the Russian church called the Hospitality of Abraham. It's become very famous. In fact, if you see it, you understand that it has taken on symbolic meaning and is understood as a manifestation of the Trinity. So if you're not familiar with it, just Google the Hospitality of Abraham and look at the images that are there. The original is still kept in Moscow, and it has been copied many times. So this is an iconic moment, as it were, literally. The letter to the Hebrews, chapter 16. It's a long letter, complicated, profound. But then in chapter 16, the author begins some reflection, sort of closing remarks, as it were, talking to the people, giving them instructions and certainly wishing them well. It begins by the simple phrase, keep on loving one another. Very important. Keep on loving one another. And then he goes on, as it were, to show how that's to happen. And he begins by saying, remember to offer hospitality to the stranger. So in the ancient world, to show love, to keep on loving, one of the most important ways was to be hospitable. But then he adds something, the author of Hebrews. For in so doing, some have entertained angels unaware. The story there is that if we had continued reading in chapter 16 of Genesis, we find out that indeed those three men were not just men. Two of them were angels. And we find out eventually that one of them is the Lord God himself. The angels were sent as messengers. That's what the word means, angels. They were messengers. Some of the message was very good and positive. They brought the annunciation, as it were, of the birth of Isaac, the descendant of Abraham, through whom the promise would be fulfilled. So that's great news. But they also had the bad news of going to Sodom and Gomorrah, and there to rescue Abraham's nephew Lot, who went there to live, even though he knew it was a sinful city. God took pity on him because of Abraham, and he sent the angels to rescue him from the destruction. As you know, the fire and brimstone were to come down on those two cities, leaving nothing behind. So these are what the angels did. The third angel, representing God himself, stayed with Abram. So we see here the beauty of hospitality, and it's how important it is to the spiritual life, which prepares us then, I think, to hear the gospel, which tells about the hospitality offered to Jesus. And we might paraphrase the letter to the Hebrews. Some have entertained God without realizing it. Jesus, God incarnate, the Son of God. So it starts out very simply. Luke tells us that there was a village. We know it was Bethany, a suburb of Jerusalem, where Jesus often went. He never stayed overnight in Jerusalem, believe it or not. He always kind of stayed in the outskirts somewhere. And he stayed with his friends, Martha and Mary. And then we know from the Gospel of John that they had a brother named Lazarus, whom eventually he would raise from the dead, the final miracle in John's Gospel. So this is the village of Bethany. And it says there was a woman whose name was Martha welcomed him. So apparently Martha owned the home, or she was the older sister, or whatever. She was in charge. We get that impression right away. She was a take-charge woman. And she was exercising what she thought was hospitality. Sweating over the hot stove, as we would say, you know. She was going in a great frenzy, trying to prepare a worthy banquet for her guest. So in itself, it seems like she's on the right track. She's doing what Abraham did. Her sister, Mary, and again, this is characteristics. When we read in John's Gospel, they have the same characteristics. So it seems to really be based on a historic reality, that Martha was the outgoing one and Mary was the more quiet, contemplative one. But in this case, what Mary did was sit at the feet of Jesus and listen to him. That also was a gesture of hospitality. That was what Jesus needed the most at that moment, to sit quietly and have a nice conversation perhaps on deep things. But she listened. She was basically at the feet of Jesus as a disciple would be. So at that moment, she was discipling, who might say. But she was exercising hospitality in her way. But Martha was blind to it. She has, as it were, as we say, the blinders on. She was just focused on her way. And she was so upset that Mary wasn't cooperating in this adventure that she actually spoke out inappropriately, really, bringing kind of, what do we say about the dirty linen, washing dirty linen in front of a guest. But she was frustrated. Jesus always speaks the truth. We never find a situation where he doesn't speak the truth. Sometimes that truth hurts. But he spoke gently, really, but truthfully. You can hear it in his voice, can't you? Martha, Martha. Kind of shaking his head. You're busy about so many things, aren't you? I hate to break it to you, but Mary has chosen the better part, and I'm not going to take it away from her. Notice the words, better part. She was exercising part of the duty of being hospitable. And it was the part that Jesus valued the most, wasn't it? Not that he didn't appreciate Martha's efforts, but what he needed most was not a banquet, but a person who would sit and listen to him. So the lesson for us then, there's many lessons that we can take from this episode. I've written down some that came to me when I was meditating on this passage, both of the passages. So this is sort of the conclusion of my homily, the take-home. Number one, hospitality is an act of love. Notice the letter to the Hebrews. Keep on loving one another. And then the first thing it tells us is continue to be hospitable to one another. Hospitality is, in essence, an act of love. Love which is focused on the needs and desires of the one loved, not one's own ego or preoccupations. So if we are to show hospitality in so many different ways as individuals and as societies, and we just think about the way, for example, refugees are being welcomed in countries. Those millions upon millions of people in our world have had to flee their home and homeland, and hopefully people of goodwill are welcoming them each into their own situation. We see that, for example, how the people of Poland have welcomed the refugees from nearby Ukraine. So we can see it on the big scale, we can see it on a personal scale. But the point is that hospitality is always focused on the needs of the one who is loved and cared for. Secondly, hospitality involves welcoming the other into one's home, literally, oftentimes. Certainly that's what Abraham did, that's what Martha and Mary did. But in the broader sense, into one's friendship, one's relationships, one's world, to let the person know that they are welcomed into your sphere, as it were. And as much as possible to say to the other, in effect, mi casa es tu casa. My home is your home. Welcome. Beautifully expresses almost the essence of true Christian hospitality. Thirdly, it's good to remember what St. Benedict taught his monks. It's written in the Rule of Benedict and treasured by monks throughout the world over the centuries. What did he say? Receive every guest as Christ. So who are we really welcoming? Jesus in disguise, as it were, like Mother Teresa talked about Jesus in the disguise of the poor and wretched and dying. But Benedict pointed out the fact that the reverence that his monks were to show to strangers coming for refuge at the monastery was every time they did that, that they were welcoming Christ himself. Just parenthetically, we know that for centuries, Benedictine monasteries were truly hospices, places where people could go for whatever they needed. That was a very important ministry of the Benedictine monks through the many centuries before the modern era, and they still do it in their own way. So receive every guest as Christ. Then fourthly and lastly, bringing it right home to what we're doing today. At Mass, Christ welcomes us, each of us, as his guests. He's welcomed each one of you here this morning. This is his house, and he's going to feed you at his table. How humbling that should be. How grateful we should be that the Lord Christ himself welcomes us and feeds us in a miraculous, wonderful way. Question would be then, do we then welcome him as the guest of our souls when we receive him in communion? He welcomes us, he feeds us, but then do we welcome him as the guest of our heart, of our souls, when we receive communion? May God bless us and keep us in his love. Amen.